The first thing Caleb Hart noticed was the silence, the kind of heavy, aching quiet that settled over the Wyoming plains just before dusk, when the wind held its breath and even the cicadas seemed to listen. And it was in that silence, thick as regret, that he saw the wooden handcart abandoned beside the dirt road, its wheels crooked, its boards splintered and worn smooth by too many miles and too much sorrow, and lying on it, wrapped in a threadbare blanket, was a woman staring up at the endless sky as if she had already begun to say goodbye to the world. And Caleb, a man known across 3 counties as someone who never lingered where trouble waited, slowed his horse despite himself, because something in the way her hands were folded over her chest, so still, so resigned, struck him deeper than any shout for help ever could. He told himself to keep riding. He had cattle to check, fences to mend, a life built carefully on the principle that you didn't survive the frontier by stopping for every broken thing. But then her eyes shifted, found him, and in them he saw not fear but acceptance, the kind that came after hope had been wrung dry, and that look reached into his chest and twisted something he'd thought had died years ago, back when he'd buried his wife under a cottonwood tree and learned the hard way that loving meant losing. So he swung down from his saddle with a curse under his breath and approached, boots crunching softly on gravel, and asked her name, to which she replied in a voice thin but steady, "Anna," as if that single word was all she had left to give. She told him she'd been traveling west with her brother, that a fall from the cart weeks earlier had stolen the use of her legs, that the fever came after, and when supplies ran out and the road grew harder, her brother had promised to return with help. But the sun had risen and set too many times since then, and she knew what abandonment felt like when it finally settled in your bones. And Caleb listened without interrupting, noticing the way her hands trembled slightly despite her calm, the way her eyes flicked now and then toward the road as if some stubborn part of her still expected salvation to appear, and something inside him rebelled against the idea of riding away, because he had been the one left once, standing alone beside fresh earth, realizing the world did not stop for grief, and he knew what it was to be invisible in pain. He told her he couldn't leave her there, that night would bring cold and wolves and worse. And she smiled faintly, not with relief but with gratitude, as if his concern alone was already a gift, and said she understood if he did, because kindness was rare currency out here, and no one owed her anything. And that was when Caleb felt the full weight of the choice before him, the familiar tug of war between self-preservation and compassion, and he surprised himself by cutting the straps on the handcart, fashioning a makeshift sling, and gently lifting her as if she were made of glass, settling her across his saddle while whispering reassurances he wasn't sure he believed. And as they rode toward his ranch, the sky bled orange and purple, and Anna closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of horse and leather, the sound of another human being choosing not to abandon her. And Caleb rode slower than he ever had, every step a silent vow he hadn't yet named. His ranch was modest, a weathered cabin, a small corral, land that had been wrestled from the earth by stubbornness rather than wealth. And when he carried Anna inside and laid her on his bed, she apologized for being a burden, for taking up space, for existing in a body that no longer worked the way it should, and he felt a flash of anger on her behalf, not at her but at a world that taught people their worth was measured by usefulness. And he told her she was safe, that she could stay as long as she needed, words that echoed strangely in his ears because he hadn't hosted another soul since his wife died. And in the days that followed, their lives settled into an unexpected rhythm, Caleb cooking simple meals, Anna helping where she could by sorting beans, mending clothes with careful hands, telling stories of the places she'd seen, the dreams she'd had before the accident. And though her legs remained still, her spirit was anything but broken, and that unsettled Caleb more than despair ever could, because it forced him to confront his own quiet resignation, the way he'd been living half alive, convinced that survival was enough. There were moments of doubt, when supplies ran low, when neighbors questioned his sanity for taking in dead weight, when Anna's pain flared and she cried silently into her pillow thinking he couldn't hear. And there was the unexpected return of her brother weeks later, gaunt and ashamed, expecting to find a grave and instead finding his sister alive, cared for by a man who owed her nothing. And in that confrontation, truth spilled out, apologies were made, and choices were laid bare, because her brother wanted to take her back east, to place her in an institution where she'd be fed and forgotten. And Caleb watched Anna's face as she listened, saw the flicker of fear, and realized with a jolt that somewhere along the way, Her presence had become essential to him, that the cabin no longer echoed with loss but with meaning, and when he spoke up, his voice shook not with anger but with conviction, telling her brother that Anna deserved more than to be hidden away, that she deserved a life, and that if she chose to stay, he would stand by that choice. The decision was Anna's, and the night she made it, the wind howled outside as if the plains themselves were waiting, and she told Caleb she wanted to stay, not because she loved him, though that realization hovered unspoken between them, but because here, she was seen, valued, needed for who she was, not what she could do, and that choice marked a turning point, because Caleb committed then not just to caring for her but to fighting for her future, riding miles to towns and doctors, learning exercises to ease her pain, building a sturdier chair so she could move independently, and in those efforts, he discovered a strength he hadn't known he still possessed, a capacity for hope that grew each time Anna laughed, each time she looked at him not as a rescuer but as a partner in a shared life. The emotional climax came one spring morning when Anna, after months of effort and setbacks, managed to stand with braces in Caleb's steady hands, trembling but upright, tears streaming down both their faces as the sun spilled through the open door, because it wasn't the miracle of walking that mattered most. It was the proof that patience, love, and relentless kindness could create change where none seemed possible, and though she would never walk as she once had, she stood in that moment as a testament to resilience, and Caleb knelt before her, overwhelmed by the realization that stopping on that road had saved not just her life but his own. Years later, neighbors would tell the story of the cowboy who refused to ride away, of the woman left on a handcart who built a home instead of a grave, and of how one act of compassion rippled outward, softening hardened hearts and reminding a harsh world that humanity survived not through strength alone but through the courage to care. And in the quiet evenings on the porch, watching the plains stretch endlessly before them, Caleb and Anna would sit side by side, hands entwined, knowing that hope was not something you found by chasing horizons, but something you created the moment you chose not to look away. The seasons kept turning after that spring morning, and with each passing month the ranch changed in small but meaningful ways, as if the land itself had noticed that two broken lives were learning how to hold each other upright, because Anna's presence brought a softness to places Caleb hadn't realized had grown hard. Flowers appeared near the porch where there had only been dust. Laughter replaced the long silences that once haunted the cabin, and neighbors who had initially shaken their heads began stopping by under the pretense of borrowing tools or sharing news, though what they really came for was to see the woman who refused to disappear and the cowboy who had chosen heart over habit. Anna learned the rhythms of the ranch from her chair, calling out reminders about weather and livestock, keeping ledgers with careful handwriting, and even teaching the children of nearby homesteads how to read and write when their parents realized she carried a mind sharper than any blade. And those afternoons, when young voices filled the cabin, stirred something deep in Caleb, a longing he'd buried with his wife, a grief he'd thought was permanent, now slowly loosening its grip as he watched Anna guide the children with patience and warmth, never once letting them pity her, because she spoke of her legs not as a tragedy but as a truth she lived alongside. Yet life on the frontier never allowed joy to settle without testing it. In the unexpected turn came the winter. A brutal storm rolled in early, burying fences, killing cattle, and cutting the ranch off from town for weeks. A storm so fierce it reminded Caleb how fragile everything still was, because supplies dwindled, Anna's pain worsened in the cold, and one night, as the wind screamed like a living thing outside, she fell ill with a fever that returned them both to the fear of losing what they had only just begun to understand. And Caleb sat by her bed, holding her hand, whispering promises he wasn't sure the world would honor, realizing that love, real love, did not protect you from loss but demanded you face it fully. And when the fever broke after days that felt like years, he wept openly for the first time since burying his wife, his tears soaking into the blanket as Anna's fingers tightened weakly around his, grounding him in the present, reminding him that survival was no longer enough, that life was meant to be shared even when it hurt. News of their resilience spread farther than either expected, and when spring returned, a traveling doctor arrived at the ranch, having heard rumors of a woman who had stood again after being left for dead, and though he offered no miracles, he offered understanding, tools, and a belief that improvement, even if small, was worth fighting for, and Anna embraced the work with a determination that inspired everyone around her. pushing through exhaustion, celebrating inches instead of miles, teaching Caleb that progress did not need to be dramatic to be meaningful. Her brother visited once more, changed by guilt and time, and this time he did not come to take her away but to ask forgiveness, humbled by the life she had built without him, and Anna forgave him, not because he deserved it, but because carrying anger would have chained her to that wooden handcart forever, and watching her release that weight taught Caleb another lesson about strength, one he carried into every interaction afterward, choosing patience over pride, empathy over judgment. Years passed, and the ranch became more than a home. It became a place of quiet refuge, where travelers stopped for a meal, where wounded animals were tended instead of shot, where stories were shared by firelight, and each act of kindness traced its origin back to that first choice on the road, that single moment when Caleb had dismounted instead of riding on. And one evening, under a sky crowded with stars, Caleb finally voiced what had been growing in his heart, telling Anna that loving her had not replaced the love he'd lost but expanded it, that his past no longer felt like a closed door but a path that had led him exactly where he needed to be. And Anna, eyes shining, told him that being seen, truly seen, had given her more mobility than her legs ever could, because it allowed her to move freely in the world again. They married quietly, without spectacle, their vows spoken on the porch with the plains bearing witness, and the emotional truth of it was simple yet profound, that two people who had been discarded by fate had chosen each other anyway, transforming compassion into commitment. And as the years wore on, children who had once learned their letters at Anna's table grew into adults who carried her lessons forward. Neighbors who had once doubted became protectors, and the story of the woman on the handcart evolved into a legend not because of tragedy but because of hope, because it reminded people that humanity was not found in grand gestures but in everyday choices, in stopping when it would be easier to pass by, and in the final years, when age slowed Caleb's steps and Anna's body grew more fragile, they would sit together watching the horizon, content not because life had been easy but because it had been meaningful, knowing that the legacy they left was not measured in land or cattle but in the lives touched by one act of kindness. And when Caleb eventually passed, Anna carried on, telling the story to anyone who would listen, her voice steady, her message unwavering, that even in the harshest landscapes, love could take root, that no one was ever truly helpless if someone chose to care, and that the moment you decide not to ride away is the moment you begin to change the world.